You whose hearts are broken, come in. You whom pain has touched and sorrow and shock, you who have cried this week, who have read the news with sadness, you whom loss has shadowed, you who grieve, come in, come in. You with hearts open to joy and hope, come in. You whom love has touched and friendship and wonder, you who have laughed this week and felt gratitude for life's many blessings, you to whom gifts are given in abundance, you who rejoice, come in, come in. All our hearts are broken and open. All of us here grieve and rejoice. This is our place, this is our hour to gather and to sing and to laugh and to cry. Come in and let us worship together. I'd like to invite you, whether you're here in the sanctuary or at home on Zoom, to join this morning in singing for the second week in a row, in a long, long while, our first hymn, which is in your hymnals but also printed in your order of service, hymn number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song. Please rise in body or in spirit as you feel so moved. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the First Parish in Bedford this snowy morning, sunny morning with snow on the ground. In any case, it is good to be together, and we ought not to take our gathering in person for granted. We gather this morning mindful of those in Ukraine and the terrible tumult and strife that they are undergoing now. My retired colleague Tom Owentoll has said there isn't a member of any congregation who doesn't also hold membership in the largest fellowship in the world, the communion of those who bear the mark of suffering and pain. And we remember this morning that we are in communion not only with one another, but with those all around the world who are struggling. We hold them in our hearts. It is hard to know what to do for them this morning. So this morning we are going to do what we can do today. We're going to sing, and we're going to sing about singing, and we're going to sing some more, right? Because there's a power in music and there's a power in song that heals the broken heart, and that is what we are here for today. We are also going to sing, and like I said, we're going to hear a story. We're going to share our joys and concerns. We are going to have an opportunity to practice our generosity. We are going to reflect a little bit on belonging and commitment, and then we'll sing some more. And toward the end of the service, we'll hear from some of the members of our congregation, some brief reflections on what it means to them to be members of this congregation, to belong here. And so I welcome you to this service. It looks like we have already run out of light, of fuel for our fire, but we will carry on, and perhaps we will have our chalice lit again before the end of the service. But for now, some announcements. First of all, I want to invite you from the Earth Connections team to join them for the March Family Friendly Earth Connections event, which is a maple sugaring tour on March 19th at the Ipswich Wildlife Sanctuary in Topsfield, to learn about the sap to syrup making practice and learn how sugaring evolved from Native American practices to modern day. This hour-long program covers a naturalist-led walk exploring the forest with maple trees, the collection of sap from maple tapping, the evaporation of it over a wood-burning evaporator in an open sugaring shack, and sampling the maple sugar. There are limited spots for this event, and so they ask that you please RSVP by next Friday, this coming Friday, March 4th, and get your payment to the church office by then to secure your spot. The RSVP link was sent to the church email list and will also be included in the upcoming parishioner, and all are welcome to join. The second announcement I have is about the Lyceum, which will be next Sunday, March 6th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Zoom. Our own Dr. Larry Hertz will be giving a talk on circadian and other biological rhythms, and there is more information about that circulating about on email as well, so please look for it and join us for that. And finally, there's a board meeting, a regular monthly parish board meeting this coming Tuesday night at 7 p.m. I don't think, other announcements at this time, but I would like to invite you to stay after the service if you're on Zoom, to join perhaps in some conversation and potentially some breakout rooms you'll hear more about, to reflect on membership and belonging. And for those of you who are here in the sanctuary, if you'd like to gather and connect with one another in small groups after the service, you'll hear more about that opportunity later in the service as well. The most important thing we can do this morning is to begin again to connect with one another and celebrate those connections. At this time, I'd like to invite you to join me in saying together the unison affirmation of this church, first in English and then in Spanish. And so I invite you, again, whether in body or in spirit, to rise and join together. Love is the spirit of this church. and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor y ayudarnos los unos a los otros. Thank you, and you may be seated. It is a one-woman show here this morning, folks. Annie is on vacation, and Brad is also on vacation, and they both have well-deserved breaks. But I am here with you, as are some members of our tech team, and of course Steve and Lori from our lay pastoral team, and all of you, and together we will get through this. I do have, as is part of my tradition, a story to share with you this morning. We are of many ages, though not all ages, but still, while the RE folks, the faith development folks, are meeting elsewhere in the building, I want to share a story with you because I think we deserve to hear stories too. This story is one of my favorites. It's based on a fable by Leo Tolstoy, and it's written by a man named John J. Muth. And this is how he tells the story. Once, there was a boy named Nikolai who sometimes felt uncertain about the right way to act. I want to be a good person, he told his friends, but I don't always know the best way to do that. Nikolai's friends understood that concern, and they wanted to help him. If only I could find the answers to my 3 questions, Nikolai continued, then I would always know what to do. His 3 questions were these: when is the best time to do things? Who is the most important one? And what is the right thing to do? Nikolai's friends considered his first question, and then Sonia, who was a heron in this story, spoke. And she said, to know the best time to do things, one must plan in advance. And then Gogol, the monkey, who had been rooting through some leaves to find something good to eat, said, you will know when to do things if you watch and pay close attention. And then Pushkin, the dog, who was dozing off just then, rolled over and said, you can't pay attention to everything by yourself. You need a pack to keep watch and help you decide when to do things. For example, Gogol, he said, a coconut is about to fall on your head. Nikolai thought for a moment, and then he asked a second question. Who is the most important one? Those who are closest to heaven, said Sonia. Those who know how to heal the sick, said Gogol, rubbing his noggin after having been hit by that coconut. Those who make the rules, said Pushkin. Nikolai thought some more, and then he asked his third question, what is the right thing to do? Flying, said Sonia. Having fun all the time, said Gogol. Fighting, growled Pushkin. Then the boy thought for a long while. He loved his friends. He knew they were all trying their best to help him answer his question, but their answers didn't seem quite right, and so he decided to go ask Leo, the wise turtle who'd been living off alone in the woods for some time. So Nikolai hiked high up into the mountains where the old turtle lived, and when he arrived, he found Leo digging a garden. The turtle was old, and the digging was hard for him. But Nikolai just barged right in and said, hey, I have 3 questions for you, Leo. When is the best time to do things? Who is the most important one? And what is the right thing to do? Leo listened carefully, but only smiled and continued with his digging. Eventually, Nikolai got smart. He said, you must be tired. Let me help you. So the turtle gave him his shovel and thanked him, and because it was easier for a young boy to dig than for an old turtle, Nikolai kept digging those rows in the garden until they were finished. But just as he finished, the wind blew wildly and the rain burst from dark clouds above, and they moved into the cottage for shelter. But then Nikolai heard a cry for help. So he ran out of the cottage and down the path, and he found a panda whose leg had been injured by a fallen tree. And he picked up the panda and carefully carried her into Leo's house and made a splint for her leg. And the storm raged on, banging the doors and the windows. And the panda woke up and said, "Where am I? And where is my child?" So the boy ran out of the cottage again and down the path, and the roar of the storm was deafening, and the pushing of the howling wind and the drenching rain was slowing him down, but he ran farther into the forest, and there he found the panda's child, cold and alone and shivering on the ground. The little panda was wet and scared, but alive, and so Nikolai swooped her up and took her back to the cottage and made her warm and dry and laid her in her mother's arms. And Leo smiled when he saw what the boy had done. The next morning the storm had passed and the sun was warm and the birds were singing and all was well with the world. The panda's leg was healing nicely, and she thanked Nikolai for saving her and her panda baby from the storm. And Nikolai's friends arrived to make sure that everyone was all right, and Nikolai felt great peace. He knew he had wonderful friends and he had saved the panda and her child, but he also felt a little bit of disappointment that he had not found the answers to his 3 questions. So he asked Leo one more time. And the old turtle looked at the boy and said, "But your questions have been answered." "They have?" said the boy. "Well, yesterday, if you had not stayed to help me dig my garden, you wouldn't have heard the panda's cries. Therefore, the most important time was the time you spent digging in my garden. The most important one at the moment was me, and the most important thing to do was to help me with my garden. Later, when you found the injured panda, the most important time was the time that you spent with her, mending her leg and saving her child. The most important ones were the panda and her baby, and the most important thing to do was to take care of them and make them safe. Remember then that there is only one important time, and that time is now. The most important one is always the one that you are with, and the most important thing to do is to do good for the one who is standing at your side. For these, my dear boy, are the answers to what is most important in the world. This is why we are here." Here ends our story for this morning. And now we'll have some joys and concerns shared. Thank you. No? Oh my goodness. So you have to keep me honest. We are going to sing another hymn. Yes. And that hymn is number 18 in your hymnals, printed in your order of service. What Wondrous Love. We are grateful for our connections to one another, whether you're here with us in person or at home on Zoom. We are grateful for our friends who are part of this church community, for those who gather round and help mend our pain and sorrow, and for those who help us celebrate our joys. We are grateful for the connections that we have made and those that we are yet to make here as part of this beloved community. And in the spirit of that gratitude for those connections, I invite you this morning to give generously, to support the work of this church and the ongoing work of this church in the larger community. Let us take up our morning offering. Well, I'm going to take this off. As you know, my heart is heavy this morning, and this has been honestly a bear of a sermon to write this week. It has been one of those weeks when I have set out with one purpose and inherited another. But I promised a sermon that would speak to the meaning of membership, and I am going to try to bring it round. A couple of weeks ago, I preached a sermon in which I mentioned Holocaust survivor Henry Greenbaum and Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine, about the Stalin's manufactured famine in Ukraine, and about James Luther Adams, a preeminent liberal theologian of the 20th century amongst Unitarians in particular, who spent a year in Germany in 1935 and 36, where he witnessed many of the atrocities of the Nazi regime, as well as some courageous acts of resistance on the part of some church leaders. Our eyes were on Ukraine even then, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and since Thursday night when the Russian invasion began, I have been thoroughly distracted, I must say, by the news of those on the ground in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in Kharkov. Some of you may have been too. I see some nodding of heads. I've been getting up in the morning and checking the news right away to make sure that those in those cities under attack have fared well as could be expected. I said in an email yesterday that I might have some words to say about Ukraine, but what words are sufficient? The words that come to mind are horrifying, but also clarifying, inspiring, and heartening. Horrifying because, of course, of the brutal and unjustified military assault against the innocent civilians of Ukraine and the utter madness and senselessness of it all. Clarifying, I think of a woman I read about yesterday who was asked by a journalist what she feared most, and she said she was insulted by the question. She wasn't afraid, she said, she was angry. And I have found that helpful to me somehow, that somehow this news, this war, these last 72 hours have helped me to shift my own fear into anger and a distinct sense of purpose. Inspiring because this is a story in many ways about an underdog taking on a bully. It's a story about all hands on deck as Ukrainians of different experiences and different political points of view unify to fight against the aggressor with great courage and with their humanity and humor intact in many cases. It's a story of their selfishness and the willingness to sacrifice their comfort and even their lives in defense of a great cause. Heartening. Well, this is heartening in part because for the last few years we've been watching some in our own country refuse to wear masks, even to protect the most vulnerable neighbors, and to see Ukrainians rallying for this cause, to see the world rallying to support Ukraine, to see Russian citizens rallying to take very real risks to speak out against their own regime. This is, to my mind, heartening. Between the news of Ukraine and the domestic news this week of anti-trans policy in Texas and anti-gay legislation in Florida, ouch, it has been a rough week again. While the former president defends Putin and some of his allies this week are speaking at a white nationalist conference, it feels truly like we are part of a global struggle for the very survival of democracy, threatened by enemies both within and without. And we are in solidarity with and connected to all those others who want to live free of tyranny, who believe in and will defend democracy and human dignity. As I was choosing hymns this week, I felt like some of the hymns that I've been singing for 25 or more years took on some kind of new life for me. And with news that Kyiv and Kharkov had made it through yet another night of heavy shelling, I woke up this morning really wanting to sing with you that first hymn that we sang together, but to change the words. When tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can we keep from singing? To bomb shelters and basements cold, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by war are undefiled, how can we keep from singing? Of course, we have no idea what is happening now or what will happen next, but our hearts are big enough to hold those connections. Those are some of my words about Ukraine, but I do want to get back to this topic of belonging and the meaning of membership and making connections, which, as your thought to ponder says in your order of service, is the essence of religious experience. The idea for this sermon came from my trying as a newcomer and as an interim to try to get to know you better and to understand this church and how it works. You have 400 or so members, but because of this damn pandemic, I've only had an opportunity to interact with what feels like a small fraction of you. Certainly fewer than half of you, maybe only as many as a third, which honestly feels quite surreal and disconcerting. Just over 100 of you or so serve on committees according to the roster in your last annual report. That's about 25% of your membership. Roughly 65 or so log in to Zoom on any given Sunday, though some logins represent more than one person, of course. And we have, 35 people here in the sanctuary this morning, which is wonderful. But I know that there are so many of you that I have not yet met and may never meet. I'm left wondering, who are the other members of this congregation? And I'm left wondering how many of you are feeling active and engaged and committed, and how active and engaged and committed you are feeling. To the extent that you might be feeling disconnected, how much of that is the pandemic? I'm assuming most of it, but how much is related to the departure of your beloved retired minister? I'm not sure we'll be able to ever parse that out. I've stood week after week in your beautiful, big, functional kitchen making single cups of coffee and looking at all of your array of coffee-making materials. And I have read about, but have not yet had a chance to experience your too crowded common rooms and your bustling 7-day-a-week church. But I sincerely hope that someday I will. I know you used to complain about how crowded it was, but I imagine that you're longing for those days to return. In the midst of this sense of surrealness, there are two sentiments related to engagement and connection that I keep hearing voiced with some frequency. First, from the people who serve on committees, I hear, we need more people on our committees. And second, from some of the people whom committee members long to have serving on their committees, I hear, oh my God, we are so freaking tired and struggling to keep ourselves and our families above water. Please don't ask us to do anything more, especially serve on committees. Right? Those are two realities in this congregation. Now, I knew this was an issue facing the congregation when I arrived. It was named in the interim search materials, and I've heard that it was a problem since before the pandemic. But how big a problem and how long-standing a problem is it? So during these last couple of months, I've been slowly reading through annual reports from 1964 through 2021. Sure enough, it's not a new problem. I learned that for instance, and we'll go backwards in time, in 2019, when you had about 401 members, a task force was convened to look at committees and volunteerism, and that work was put on hold because of the pandemic, and it is getting started again. In the 2016 and 17 annual reports, it was noted that the primary area of concern for committees and task forces was finding volunteers, and that many of us wonder if our structure is ideal for the church's demographics. A decade earlier, so jumping back to John's 2007 annual report, he noted that too often I and others have shouldered too much responsibility for too much of our First Parish program. It is not sustainable. Ministry must be shared. He said, I believe we face a future when our effectiveness as a church must be measured by the strength of our common participation, our shared ministry. The following year, as many of you remember, you were here, a volunteer coordinator position was created and ably filled by Sandy Bazanowski for, I think, 7 years. And one of the things that struck me was that when she entered the role, she thought she had 437 volunteers to work with, but closely realized that the actual number to draw upon was closer to 285, because of course not every member can contribute in the same way, right? If you're away, if you're in college, if you're physically unable to help with some of the tasks, if you're ill, if you've moved out of town, if you have small children, you can't participate in church life in the same way. But the other thing that was interesting was that during the 7 or so years that Sandy did this work, while the number of members in the church went up, the volunteer pool went down by about 50 people, according to her records. And it goes back even further to 1999 when John, this is over 20 years ago, described the over-involvement of some and the disengagement of others. And then a decade before that, it was noted that volunteerism was still a concern and that coffee hour volunteers were still hard to find. And then a decade before that, in 1976, it was noted that some of the same people are doing the same critical jobs year after year. And interestingly, in 1974, the church expanded the number of committees that it had from 11 to 18 to increase the opportunities for volunteers to get involved. And a decade before that, in 1964, which is the earliest report that is in the main office files, the Parish Promotion Committee proclaimed emphatically, "The church is you. You must extend yourselves more." Whoa. In fact, it goes back even further to this 1959 study that was done by outsiders who came to study this church. And at that time, in 1959, the so-called responsibility list of this parish included 263 people. And I'm not clear if that means the church was responsible for 263 people, or if the 263 people were expected to take responsibility for the church. But in either case, that report predicted that at the current rate of growth at that time, the church could be 420 members by 1969, which didn't happen. But the most interesting thing to me, having read through all of these annual reports, was that those who wrote this report said that it was a source of amazement to them that over 55% of the congregation at that time was not involved in helping to run the organization. Now, you might today kill to have 45% of your members involved in the work of this congregation, but back then when society was so different, they were expecting it to be more like 70 or 75% involved, and were shocked that it was not that high. And so doing all of this, I have an observation and I have a thought. And the observation is that growth, by which I mean adding members, has not one single time fixed this problem. Not once. And I do wonder if there is something particular to the history of this church that has contributed to this pattern. The writers of that 1959 study seemed surprised based on what they knew of other congregations at the time. But I don't want to suggest by any means that you are alone in this. I want to share that the church that I served as settled minister for 14 years in Harvard, Massachusetts, had similar struggles. In 1958, the standing committee chair, a man named Clyde Fairbanks, challenged members to get engaged with the process that was going on in the time, ending his report with what he called a few words for thought that read in part, "Are you an active member, the kind that would be missed? Or are you just contented that your name is on the list? Do you attend the meetings and mingle with the flock, or do you stay at home and criticize and knock? Do you take an active part to help the work along, or are you satisfied to only just belong?" And in 1959, the next year, my predecessor, the Reverend Rudy Nemzer's report, notes that practically every previous annual report I have written, he said, has pointed out the need for greater participation and leadership on the part of the members of this church. We are now in the position, he said, where this is absolutely essential, for the functioning and well-being of the church depends not on the minister, but on the individual members, and this is how it should be. And we too struggled during my 14 years there with some of the same issues that you struggled with here during that time. And of course, cultural context matters. 2 parents working now, longer hours, more activities for kids, changes in attitudes about church. We have become more consumers and less like citizens in terms of how we see ourselves, not necessarily all of us, but in general in society. Church attendance and participation has been dropping across the board, and to reverse all that is to swim like a salmon against the stream. So many of our UU churches were struggling, in fact, that in June of 2001, the Commission on Appraisal published a report on the meaning of membership within Unitarian Universalism, which is called belonging. And in it, the Commission began by saying, Often, these days, we hear people say that they are seeking a spiritual community, but want nothing to do with organized religion. By the former, they seem to mean a place that will meet their own religious needs. The latter, they seem to associate with a place that will make demands upon them to support the institution's needs. Ha! Well, I want to say, first of all, that there's nothing wrong with hoping to have some of your needs met in coming to church. That is part of what church is here for. That is why we come. We come to grow our souls in community, and we need our community to help us grow. And at the same time, community does make demands on us as well. The institution that fosters our soul growth has needs too, and as the Commission on Appraisal report says, the reality is that you cannot have one without the other. And part of the church's job is to lead people to the discovery of the spiritual truth that it is only in giving that we receive, giving not only our money but ourselves. This was 2001. Traditionally, what has it meant to give yourselves to a church? It has meant serving on committees, right? What John in the past has called church work, as opposed to the work of the church. I was thinking about this week, and I was remembering a book that I had written some years ago by a man named Thomas Bandy, who's an evangelical Christian church consultant. And in one of his books, he has an alternative creation story that goes like this. In the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit brooded upon the waters of the deep, and God said, "Let there be a long prescriptive mission statement. Let there be a clear ecclesiology to separate the church from the world. Let there be committees that yield fruits of every kind. Let there be programming by day and by night. Let there be parliamentary procedure and inter-office memos creeping or flying between administrative units. Let there be elected officials of every kind, and let the pastor be CEO." And on the seventh day, God rested from labor and saw that the church was very good, and church people have been exhausted ever since. Right? I believe people join churches seeking connection and seeking a sense of belonging, and we all too often have been met with open arms and work assignments. And yet, we don't seem to know any other way to do church work after all these years of trying, and some of that work does need doing. And so it seems to me that there are at least a few questions that we have to ask, and I don't have the answers to any of them. But the questions are these. What is the essential work of the church? The stuff that needs to get done by committee to maintain and sustain the church and its resources, money, property, and people for future generations. 2, how do we either get this essential work done by fewer people or get more people involved in it? And 4, no matter what, how do we feed and nurture the spirits of those who are doing the essential work so that it does not feel tedious and dispiriting to do it, but instead feels enlivening and energizing, like the work of the church? Like I said, I don't have the answers, and I don't have the time to try to imagine the answers. I have curiosity. And I want to invite you to keep thinking about these questions with me, because the interim time is a good time to do that, to ponder such things, and because the pandemic offers the opportunity for a radical shift. There is no going back to what we did before. I also want to add before I close that the story that I shared may or may not be instructive. Sometimes, maybe the most important things are not, as Nikolai's friends Sophia the heron and Pushkin the dog suggest, the strategic planning and the organizational structures and the policies and the procedures and our efforts to strive for more or to soar above or to always struggle onward. And maybe it's not all like Gogol the monkey says about having fun and having our own needs met. Sometimes, maybe the most important thing is simply about doing what needs to be done in order to help the ones you're with. Maybe digging the garden is a metaphor for the church work, for tending the institution, for preparing the ground for future. And maybe saving the panda becomes a metaphor for the work of the church. The one puts you in proximity so that you can hear the call of the other. Ultimately, membership is about belonging. It's about belonging has everything to do with feeling connected to both people and to a shared sense of purpose. And maintaining that connection requires commitment, and without commitment, our relationships fail and our institutions fail and community founders. The Reverend Tom O'Toole, who I quoted earlier in the service, writes about commitment as being kind of like doing the hokey pokey with his children. You know the drill, he says. You put your right foot in and you take your right foot out, and you put your right foot in and you shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself about. That's what it's all about. He says it starts with the right foot and then it goes through most of the limbs and it ends with putting your whole self in. And that is what you're aiming for when you make a commitment to a community. Eventually, putting more and more of yourself in and shaking it all about. May we find ways to make our commitments fun and energizing and life-giving and sustaining, that we might be renewed. The sermon portion of the service is ending, but there are wiser words than mine to be shared on this topic. As some of you have read and know, the transition team of this congregation has been starting to work on looking back at the heritage of this congregation, not only so that you can hear and understand and talk about the history, but so that people can connect to the history in different ways. And I believe that Tina, who is on Zoom, is going to be introducing two speakers of the transition team who are going to share their own reflections on membership.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nappy, and I'm speaking on behalf of the rest of your interim ministry transition team members, Doug Denny Brown, Doug Mooter, Kath McCafferty, Maureen Richichi, Meredith McCulloch, and Rebecca Neal. And your team has been meeting, and we are going to be beginning a series of congregational conversations. And as our beloved parishioner Meredith McCulloch has stated, this is a time for looking back before we step forward. And so over the next few months, we're going to be sponsoring a heritage moment during some of the Sunday worship services. One or two people will share a brief 5-minute reflection about a topic or an event in First Parish history. And after the service, the transition team members will be in the sanctuary and on Zoom to facilitate small group discussions about the heritage moment. And we hope that you will join us immediately after these services and join in those conversations. Today, we are really pleased to have two of our team members and parishioners, Meredith and Rebecca, share their thoughts on the topic of membership and belonging. And we asked them, and we're going to ask you also, to consider the following questions. When did you join First Parish in Bedford? What was one pivotal thing that was happening in the world or in the church community when you joined? And what did it mean to you to decide to become a member? So with that, I thank you, and I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca and Meredith.
The first task of any parishioner is to unmute appropriately. Wendy, you're a hard act to follow. When we first came to Bedford in 1968, my husband John and I, We're on a journey away from the traditional Christianity of our youth, and we're going to look for a church home. I first noticed First Parish when there was a rally on the Common, and David Weisbard, the minister, was reading the names of all of those who died in Vietnam. I'd like to say parenthetically, forgive me for being on the verge of tears between my love of the church and my fear for Ukraine. I'm kind of overwrought this morning. So we went to the rally, and as we kind of settled into the life of the town, we realized the people we most admired went to First Parish, and this became apparent over and over. The following year, David Weisbard, our minister, went on sabbatical, so we'd hardly had a chance to get to know him. And we saw a church that was flourishing with no apparent hierarchy. That was very encouraging. And it gave a sense of ownership and responsibility that might not have come otherwise. In the meantime, people in the church were very welcoming, inviting us to potlucks and circle suppers. People like Barbara Laughlin, Pulliam's Dodd Ellis. They helped us to understand what was going on at First Parish. My husband used to claim we ate our way into the church, because the truth is we were on the edge of the church for a while we did the social things. Deciding to join was easy. Once we pledged, we decided we ought to join. And my family had moved a lot when I was a child, and always did two things when in a new place: join a church, Methodist at that point, and get a library card. First Parish has been central to my life ever since. Thank you. I made it through without completely crying.
Good morning, I'm Rebecca Green Neal. There are about 14 years between when I joined the church and when I became a member, so please forgive me for indulging me in a few memories, short memories. When did I join First Parish? Well, I joined as a toddler, maybe a preschooler. I was spirited off to the nursery downstairs and played with my favorite toys. Those are my earliest memories of being in church. As a child, my most important moments of church, of course, revolved around me. So, one of those memories was my dedication by Reverend Jack Mendelson, where I stood in front of the sanctuary somewhere around here. It looked a little different back then. And I beamed with the love and the reception of this community, this congregation, as he dedicated my sister Carrie and I. And that day I remember bringing home the flower, the carnation that I was given. And during that time growing up, I remember, we would come to church, and after RE, we would go up to Fellowship Hall, which is on the second floor here before the addition. It was a predecessor to the common room. The adults were drinking coffee. Some things don't change, right? And someone would chime on a little xylophone, indicating that it was talkback time to go into the bacon room and talk about the service. And to that sound was a cue to my sister and I to go hit up my parents for $1 or $2 so that we could go to the penny candy store across the street, which is right behind Kent's Deli, that yellow house. It's a country store. And so at that time, the kids really did have the run of the place. It was a different time, less supervision. There are more locks in the building now. Okay, we could go up to the steeple if we wanted. There was no lock on that door. We could go underneath the sanctuary into the basement. There was no lock on that door. Believe it or not, we actually didn't do that a lot. We just knew we could, which was kind of one piece about feeling like this was my space. You know, this was very much my space for my sister and I, my family, and the whole community. So the things I remember were our annual plays as kids, our holiday potlucks and our sing-alongs, our Christmas sing-alongs. I remember the flower communion every year. And as I grew, the pivotal moments were less about me and more about church. At some point, Jack Mendelson moved on, and we had an interim minister, Reverend Douglas Morgan Strong, who was the first openly gay minister to serve a UU congregation. After he was here for 2 years, John was called to serve, John Gibbons, of course, who we all know and love. As I got older, I started attending services. I attended Talkback. I remember attending one Talkback where Rich Doherty, who's here, said to me, we were talking about RE, or religious education, and he said, I don't know if the kids here even know what the 10 principles are. And he said, Rebecca, do you know? And I said, I don't know. I didn't really know what UU was all about. I really had no reference for other churches, because I only knew this one. But to give a little context, what was happening, not in the world and not in church, but in Bedford, it was either my junior or senior year in high school, there was someone wanted to start a gay-straight alliance in the high school. And the powers that be at high school decided to have a discussion after school about whether to have the gay-straight alliance. And this was in the 90s, maybe 1994 or 5 or something. And in retrospect, I'm thinking, wait, was this like a referendum meeting to approve whether to have a gay-straight alliance? It's kind of horrifying, right? At the time that we did it, I thought that that's what it was, and I was trying to get folks to come to support it. And I don't remember being able to get some of my closest friends to come. I do remember walking into that room and seeing on one side of the room the football team and their girlfriends, and on the other side of the room was my youth group. It wasn't like the youth group person had organized anything. It just so happened that the people I went to church with at First Parish all showed up to support the Gay-Straight Alliance in high school. And so even though we couldn't name the 10 UU principles, and maybe we still couldn't really say, what's UUism? We all showed up. And that was a pivotal moment for me in Bedford, for this church, for the youth of this church. So that by the time I became a member, sometime in 94, 95, 96, when I was old enough to sign that membership book, it was such a non-event for me. It was just, I said to John, okay, where's this membership book I should sign? You know, I was old enough, and he said, well, you don't have to sign it. I said, I know I don't have to sign it, but it's time. It was such a non-moment because I was already such a part of this community, or really, this community was already such a part of me that it was just a no-brainer. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, Rebecca, so much for sharing those experiences. And again, we would love to invite you today and in the days and weeks to come to reflect on what your membership here in this congregation, what joining, the decision to join, meant and means to you. Now I'd like to sing again, and I had a hard time deciding which version of this hymn to sing, so I was going to have us sing all 4 verses, but let's go ahead and do it. Hymn number 159, This Is My Song. Hymn number 318, We Would Be One. Let's just sing it all, and then we'll close. may be seated. Just as a reminder to those of you who are on Zoom, the Zoom room will stay open, and the tech people have divided you up into breakout rooms. If you would like to go to a room, accept the invitation. They will be facilitated by members of the transition team to continue to have conversations about membership and what it means to you. If you don't want to join, just decline the invitation, stay in the main room, or go. For those of you in the sanctuary who might be interested in having one of these conversations, we have 2 members of the transition team with us today who are willing to facilitate conversations, maybe one on one side of the congregation and one on the other. And again, if you need to go and be somewhere else, we are still so glad that you were able to be here with us this morning. As we prepare to depart, we give voice to these hopes. May we know ourselves bound in community even when we are apart. May a passion for justice continue to burn in our lives. May we carry the light of compassion in our hearts and in our every interaction. And may we be whole in our devotion to truth and always carry the lamp of peace before us. Go in peace and return again in peace. Amen.